So I do. And not to make a plug for the book, but I wrote a chapter about this because I found this to be such an interesting story, this history of Jewish meditation. And I'm just going to preface this with that Jewish meditation means, again, people have different understandings of what Jewish meditation is. But when I talk about Jewish meditation, I talk about the movement of Jewish meditation, the movement for Jewish mindfulness, which has organizations that surround it. It has some central teachings. It has books that have been written about it. And it has some blueprints is too strong of a word, but it has some degree of codification as it is practiced in the United States. And what was interesting about this, the movement for Jewish meditation, and I call it a movement because, and I'll walk you through really quickly, I know we don't have so much time, how this, like why I think of it as a movement and how this started, but what is interesting to me is it began with the Cummings Foundation. And I think this is the interesting part of the story because at least this was unknown in kind of popular, kind of in the popular tales of the encounters between Judaism and Buddhism. But Charlie Halpern, who was the president of the Cummings Foundation in the 90s, was himself a Jew and really felt that Buddhism had something to bring to Judaism, that Judaism, American Judaism, had become somewhat stale and spiritually vacant is too strong of a word, but was in need of some spiritual rejuvenation. And he thought Buddhism really was the salve for that. It had something to provide, it had something to offer. And so he funded a series of various different encounters between Jews and Buddhists to try to kind of ignite the encounter between Judaism and Buddhism in the 90s to see if it could spiritually reinvigorate American Judaism. So he funded a series of conversations on the West Coast that among Jewish teachers and Buddhist teachers, designed to bring these two traditions in conversation with each other. The Cummings Foundation funded a series of dialogues and conversations on the East Coast as well. The Cummings Foundation, they funded, and this is the nice tie-in to the 30th anniversary of Roger's book, but they funded that trip to India that Roger was on that then produced the book. Again, it was just this effort from the Cummings Foundation to really bring Judaism and Buddhism in dialogue with each other.
Wait, the Cummings Foundation sponsored that trip?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And by the way, it's just to clarify, it's the 30th anniversary of the trip.
Oh, right. The book was a few years later. Yeah. Of the trip. So yes, of the Cummings.
Oh, okay.
And then the Cummings Foundation gave money to the Institute for Jewish Spirituality in New York to create basically a Jewish meditation training program. And they brought together a series of Jewish and Buddhist teachers and leaders who created a curriculum for what Jewish meditation and Jewish mindfulness could be in the United States. And they kind of ironed out the kinks between Judaism and Buddhism and thought together about what Jewish meditation was, which pieces of it would it pull from Buddhism, which pieces would it pull from Judaism, and how to kind of tie that together. And they created a curriculum, and then they created and this still exists. It was like a Jewish mindfulness teachers training program or Jewish meditation. I think it's Jewish mindfulness teacher training program, which I believe is still in existence. And that training program brought rabbis and cantors and Jewish leaders from across the country to the Institute for Jewish Spirituality to be trained in Jewish mindfulness and Jewish meditation, and to learn these practices. And then they were then sent back out. This sounds more intentional maybe than it was, but they would get trained and then they would return to their home congregations and their home communities, and then they would teach Jewish meditation and mindfulness. They had been trained and then they became leaders in it. And as a result of that, they created a movement for Jewish meditation in which a person could go, my folks are from Akron, Ohio, and somebody could go to Akron, Ohio, for example, to a JCC there and take a Jewish meditation class. And it was more or less the same class that would be taught, let's say, in Florida, because the different teachers were all taught by the same teacher training program from the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. So again, this produced this movement for Jewish meditation, and now you have offerings in Jewish meditation all across the country. which in my experience look more similar than they do different when you move from one to another. There's always peculiarities and there's always context to everyone, but for the most part, the different ones that I sit in, I feel like I know more or less what to expect when I go.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, it's been huge. The influence of the intersection between Judaism and Buddhism has really had an enormous impact on the contemporary American Jewish community. And I think Roger's trip and the book was huge. I think in my estimation, that was like a seismic event. And I would guess in your accounting of history, is probably a really significant event, wouldn't you say?
I mean, absolutely. And I think not just the trip itself was an extremely significant event. And I think Roger's book, his writing of the trip, and it's beautifully done and so thought-provoking, was also a moment. And I think his book really popularized this phenomenon, the fact that there's a relationship between Judaism and Buddhism, and named it for the world and drew attention to it. I mean, his book, there were movies made about his book, and
Right.
it was a real moment.